the first slide, I thought I should say just a few things about my own scholarly biography. Among my current special interests are dialogical meta-theory and the meta-theory of language. And I should say right from the start that language, according to my view, has to be understood as languaging in action and dialogue. That is, in a much broader perspective than as a self-contained system, as in linguistics and several other contexts. And you have a few of my publications there, which I won't go into now. The book from 2009, Rethinking Language, etc., is perhaps the most important item there. But I will go on to present an interactional and dialogical perspective to mainstream cognitive scientific perspectives here today. And this is the content of my lecture as I have planned it. I'll say something about the background and the concept of the human mind. And then I will talk about different forms of dialogism as I conceive of them, and then about the related approach called interactivity and distributed language approach. And then I'll use quite a lot of time on a few empirical examples. Section number 6, finding one's way in the world, might be skipped if I don't have time for it. And then I will go straight on to some conclusions. I should say also from the from the start here that I am indebted especially at this occasion from my friend Sune Vogt Steffensen at Odense University in Denmark, who has developed this other approach which they call interactivity and distributed language approach. He also wrote a paper a few years ago about generations of cognitive science. That will be your, thank you, home base in many ways. But a long time ago there was a linguistic structural approach with things like generative grammar and generative semantics. That was actually before the advent of cognitive science. But Chomsky, as you know, claimed that generative grammar had something to say about psychological reality of language. Then the first generation of the cognitive approach arrived, and it's fair to say that they looked at cognitive processes simply as sequences of information processing. But those cognitive representations that are being processed there are often in principle based on a variant of a mental language. But it was different from the language we can see and hear and talk with. A third approach would be a more body-based approach where they start to talk about embodied cognition. People like Lakoff and Johnson in their book Philosophy in the Flesh. And they also built on various workers and philosophers in embodied cognition, such as Merleau-Ponty, the French philosopher. And then we have the neuro era, the neuro-linguistic and neuropsychological variants where cognition is seen in neural circuits in the brain. I'll say a little bit about that later on, but the fifth one here is what I will use most of my time on, a social interactional, that which I tend to call dialogical approach, in which not only the brains play a part, but also our bodies, our language, and that is language as we are used to encounter it in social life, in utterances. We are also building very much on others in our cognition, what others say and do or seem to do, and what the world provides in terms of artifacts of various kinds. There are obviously some tendencies which are in neuroscience which tend to portray the brain as an interactive brain, which is more compatible with this approach. The brain would then not be, as in number 4, this is slightly overstated, but yet a brain in a vat. You know, a vat is it's a kind of vessel that they use to grow tissues in some kind of fluid, and that's the only thing in the laboratory. Okay, so the linguistic and structural and cognitivist approaches 1 and 2 here typically involve abstract representations of thought and linguistic processing. Language becomes a formal structure or a self-contained processing system in the brain or the mind. It's always written brain/mind. Far from depicting actions in overt interaction or public conduct. And this is the idea of language as a formal system and formalism has a very long past in the discipline of linguistics, with historical roots going back even to antiquity. Formalism and structuralism typically assume abstract symbolic systems, as I said, and I will call this abstract cognitivism. But in many people's view, including mine, languages are not such self-contained codes. They are based on communicative and cognitive practices in the world. That is the alternative perspective of on language. Neurosciences, especially neurocognitive theories and models, have often been laid out as if cognition was wholly contained in the brain. And one might call this neuroscientific theory that of the segregated brain. The brain in the vat, as I said. Naturally, there are, maybe I'll skip that for a moment. There are, of course, the inputs from the sensory organs and the outputs to the motor organs, but all essential processing does take place in the brain, according to this view. Perhaps different from in an interactive brain of Michael Anderson and others. But it is obvious that abstract cognitivism and segregated neuroscience have a lot in common. Indeed, they might be seen as an application of the latter, segregated neuroscience, is an application of the former in terms of neurological processes. Both share an unfortunate general assumption, that of radical individualism. This means, in this context, this rather narrow context, that cognition is seen exclusively as information processing in the individual head or brain or mind, with few or no social parts, no essential social parts. So linguistic, cognitivist, and neuroscientific approaches are all individualist, putatively depicting individual processing of symbolic representations. Cartesian philosophies of mind are internalist and individualist. And there is an absence of other human beings in this account, which means that it is kind of a monologism in science. And it's perhaps most extreme, this monologism, in neuroscience. Naturally, only individuals have brains, so therefore there is very little about interactions between individuals unless you explicitly conceive of the brain as interactive. The alternative would be something that incorporates body-based theories of meaning, but also theories that give a role to other people, to the environment with their objects and artifacts, that is designed objects that you use all the time, that I'm using here on this podium, for example. So this is the dialogical alternative, if you want. If I move on to the human mind, this is a concept that we're talking about very much in our different sciences. And as you know, the British philosopher Gilbert Ryle authored a book called The Concept of Mind in the 1940s, which is now a classic. But there is certainly not only one concept of the mind in philosophy and in generations of cognitive science. There are lots to be said about this, and it might bring me into theology and the history of psychology, which I don't have the time for. Let me just mention a number of central concepts in dialogism and also in cognitive science that have been relatively fashionable among interactionists. First of all, you have the idea that the mind is social, people say. Valsina and van der Veer edited a book called The Social Mind in the year 2000, and that means that the mind is not individual, but it's partially shared with others in the community. But from the individual's point of view, it's only shared with certain others or third parties. Those who belong to one's own community mostly. So it's not entirely shared with other people. But yet there is this other denomination, the shared mind. That means that the mind is culturally shared and couldn't be understood without considering the specific culture around individuals. But again, it's only partially shared, as I will come back to. Then there is the idea of the embodied mind. The mind is not an immaterial phenomenon, as in the Cartesian tradition that described extension in time and space only to bodies. For those who highlight the reality that is experienced through our bodily organs, like Lakoff and Johnson, the mind can't exist without bodily substance. It is in the flesh. But the snag is, of course, does the mind end where the body ends? Is it contained within the boundaries constituted by the skin? Many people would oppose that idea and talk about an extended mind, which is culturally embedded. The extended mind is then precisely extended across the borders of the individual body. It must be assumed to crucially, in our world, rely on artifacts, for example, instruments, writing, and so on, and other objects and events in the outer world, and perhaps also on other cognitive agents. That is more or less what extended mind, what I already said, and the culturally embedded mind. The distributed mind is an idea launched by Stephen Cowley, who's now in Denmark. It means that the mind, including cognition and language, is not confined to being embrained inside the skull, but it also comprises the body, some parts of the environment, and other persons who interact with and coordinate their sense makings with a cognitive agent, or who have those who have contributed in earlier generations, our predecessors who have created the cultural conditions which we pick up as children. That is the cultural embeddedness. So there is this double property of the mind, that it's both embodied in people's bodies and it's culturally embedded in the communities of speakers and users. Communities with fuzzy boundaries, it's true. There is a controversy whether one should assign some kind of centrality or controlling role to the human subject, to the ego, to the self, or if the self is just one component in a cognitive system, and I will come back to that. The final term which should be mentioned in this list is dialogical mind, that proposes that the individual sense-making ability is crucially interdependent with other people's past, present, and possible future contributions. So the significance of a given utterance or a turn of talk can only be understood in terms of its relation to adjacent utterances, that which came just before and that which may come up as a continuation. The empirical study of this sequentially organized interaction has been most sophisticatedly studied within conversation analysis. Now we have seen quite a few different aspects of the mind according to an interactional or maybe generally dialogical view. This makes us come back to the original question, how to concisely define the mind. And it appears that there are two important sets of ingredients that must be mentioned in this connection. First, the mind engages in many actions and perceptions in which it explores, the mind explores the outer world. These can be construed as inactive processes or as products of action-perception cycles. You do something and you observe the effects of what you do, for example, with your hands. There are also many mental actions and products like cognizing and cognitions, thinking and inferences, remembering and memories, knowledge, learning, volitions, interest, and emotions. All these things are, as some philosophers have put it, intended towards something out there. They are about something, about things, events, processes. They have content or aboutness. So the phenomena studied, once again, are both embodied and socially, culturally, and morally embedded. Now to dialogism. What is that? Because I suggest as an antidote to formalism, internalism, and abstract cognitivism, we offer dialogism, in particular the kind that I will call extended dialogism. And there is also this other related theory called, which call themselves interactivity and distributed language approach. Both these portray language and languaging. Languaging is the use of language in the world. They portray those as distributed on different parts in the world, not just the single individual's brain. They are emergent, so they grow with experiences out of less developed forms, and they are crucially situated, that is, they are intertwined with properties of situations when they come to life. So Stephenson called these ecological theories, that is, they combine insights from social interactional, social psychological, and sociocultural theorizings. But this is not the classical dialogism that we recognize from, for example, the work of the Russian philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin. His dialogism deals almost exclusively with language-based exchanges between two or more co-present participants in spoken or signed interactions or in texts and text events. In fact, he worked more for natural reasons with texts than with living interactions. So language and the concrete exchanges between people are central to this kind of dialogism, which is a classical definition of it. But I think it's necessary to extend that notion of dialogism, or if you want, interactionism, to be concerned both with these things that we know from classical interactionism, and to at least one additional comprehensive domain, namely the interactions. In addition, the interactions leading to sense-making between a human being or several human beings and objects, artifacts, processes, and events in the environment, the social and physical world out there. That is, we need to attend not just to interaction with others, but also to interaction with the ecological environment in general. So these are so-called objective phenomena in the world provide perceivers with opportunities. Gibson calls it affordances for sense-making. Artifacts have been designed by other human beings, usually, to do exactly that, provide opportunities for use and meaning-making. And the sensory interaction of a human being with its environment builds upon close integrations of actions and subsequent perceptions of the results of these actions. Something that has been described perhaps most in greatest detail by Alva Noe. However, these two domains mentioned now, classical and extended dialogism, are actually intimately intertwined. The world has been inhabited by other people, whether they are still active or belong to earlier generations. These other people, all the earlier generations, have made it the world meaningful by categorization, verbal labeling, and discursive practices. As youngsters and as children and youngsters, and in fact throughout our lives, we are immersed in this meaningful world into which we have been thrown, to use an expression from Heidegger, and whose categories we simply by and large have to accept, and we do accept them. Sensory perception, too, is therefore indirectly independent or remains interdependent with other people's sense-makings. It has much to do with languaging. Languaging is lurking in the background there. As an example, in between the two categories of sense-making, according to classical and extended dialogism, there is actually what might be seen as a third category, namely the interaction with or use of design signs and signposts, many of which contain linguistic texts, along streets and roads, for example, telling us what we are allowed or not allowed to do in the traffic or elsewhere. They function often and do so communicatively by being followed by adequate conduct. But they may also be reacted to by spoken exchanges or private language-born deliberations and interpretive activities. Certainly they are learned by individuals who are being instructed through spoken or written language. So these designed artifacts that are ubiquitous in our milieus, in our environments, provide a link between those two domains of sense-making that are talked about under this rubric. Now I will go to interactivity and distributed language approach. It doesn't appear in the headline there, but this is the theory of people like Cowley and Stephenson and Thibault and others. There is something funny with this this slide, but Stephenson suggests that mainstream theories in cognitive sciences should be seen as I-mind theories, meaning that all the essential words begin with I. They are internalists, they are about information processing, they are individualist and intellectually biased. Whereas Stephenson's own alternative would be an E-mind type of theory, where the mind is extended beyond the individual's body. It's external because many things go on out there, but it's of course also internal. The brain is working all the time. It's ecological, embodied, embedded, and inactive. These terms you have seen already. Yeah, it comes in a strange order here, but very short overview of this other approach. This first point I just talked about. Like dialogism, it's very much about the relation of self to other people and to environments. And of course, linguistic interactivity builds on a symbiosis between a bodily dynamic dimension. It's dependent on what the body can do and what it has learned to do in a dynamic way. And there is a linguistic symbolic mode of communication, which of course has a lot to do with what one has observed in others. So interactivity and languaging are distributed on these different entities: brain, body, others, objects, artifacts, etc. But there is one difference which I have discussed at length with Sune Stephenson, and this is that he is thinking in terms of systems theory, that this is a system that works, it seems, without any entity that's controlling the sense-making to some extent. So there is no essential difference between the subject, the self, the person, and the environment. Whereas I think that the environment doesn't make sense by itself. It has to have the human perceiver and cognizer. So on that point, I think there is, we would say that sense-making is distributed, but it is asymmetrically distributed. Now, I will show you a couple of examples. And this, in order to make things easier, I have used examples which, for the purpose today, can be used in translations. This excerpt from a multi-party conversation took place in Swedish, but I've translated it into English here, and I will. The red things I'll come back to here, but I'll go through very quickly what's going to be said here. It's from a dinner conversation between 5 different female colleagues who have a dinner together, and they are from slightly different generations. Some of them were, at the time of the recording, relatively old, 60 or like that, 60, 65. And they discuss what they experienced in school when they were young, these elder participants here. And they talk about how they were forced to write their papers in the Swedish language. At that time, the Swedish written language had certain morphological differences between singular and plural verb forms, which were abandoned in the late 40s in written standards. But this episode about spelling the words and going to school a long time ago, that is closed or attempted to be closed by one of them saying, "So old are we. We are so old that we experienced this." But this turns out not to function only as a closing of the previous episode, but something new comes up here, because one of the others says, "We are so old, Asta, that there grows moss on us." And this expression here builds upon an expression in Swedish where you say that if you are old, then there will grow moss on you. And the moss is that which you find on old stones and tree trunks in the woods. So that happens when you get old. And yes, and then there is a pause. Line 4, there is a pause of 1.2 seconds, and there is an affirmation of that from one who is probably the person called D here. Then there's a long pause, and one says, "Not so salient, though." And it goes on with E say, "No, that you can't say. Not that scary." And then after another pause, 1.5 seconds, and laughter. This is line 11. On line 12, E says, "It's more like such lichen." And lichen are those, if you know, plants that are composed of fungus and algae in symbiosis. They grow on trees, so they are related somehow to mosses, I suppose. And it goes on. No? Because B says you should be happy as long as it doesn't become beard-lichen in any case. And beard-lichen, as far as I know, is a new coinage in Swedish. But it somehow suits this episode. And this makes C say how dreadful with this beer lichen growing on our bodies. It can come, they say, and they seem to be in agreement on that. But after a pause on line 27, C turns the whole thing into a serious discussion, because this was more or less jokingly talking about old age before. But now C says, I read a theory about people becoming more and more androgynous, more and more intermediate between men and women. Androgynous then. And there's some hesitation on that, but C goes on to say they get more hair on the legs and growth of beard. Yeah, says B. And then the final part. E says, but that I wonder if that's true. Biologically androgynous, that's what she's wondering about the truth of. But by contrast, socially androgynous. And then there's some ebbing out of this episode where they talk about whether social androgynous can result in biological androgynous. So the result is that in this episode, in one as a whole, we see the participants starting from talk on moss growth and old age to social and androgynous tendencies. And the question is, how does the latter topical aspect come about? Who does the meaning making? Or is the change of topic something that is due to all the individuals together, a joint construction? Therefore, I suggest that we can move backwards through the discursive trajectory. And I have used bold red here to mark new associations to a prior idea. And thin red is often repeated by a later subsequent speaker, so that you have both the repetition and the introduction of something new, a new association. So on line 37 here, you have E suggesting the distinction between biological androgyny and social one. So biological versus social is a new association, which makes a difference here. The androgynous thing is, however, not new, because it was introduced by another person, C, in line 29. The people become more and more androgynous. This is a difficult word, and they shouldn't have said that. But there's also another thing which C says here, which is actually new, because she introduces the idea of hair, which has been implicit somehow in the earlier talk, but no one has said hair on the legs. But beard has been mentioned. So beard in that utterance is old. It's a repetition in a new context with hair. So who introduces hair? The very word is introduced by C, but where does she get this idea of growth of beard? Well, it comes from perhaps more complicated than this, but it comes definitely partly from line 19, where B, another woman, has said that you will have beard lichen, which is the direct translation of skägglav, beard lichen. So that's a new idea at that stage. But where does that come from? Well, lichen was introduced by yet another person, namely E, in line 12, lichen. And that was a new word there. But it's related to something that they talked about, which appears as a pronoun there in the same utterance, it. It's more like such lichen. What is it? Well, it is the moss that grew or grows on people, women, when they get older. And moss was introduced by E, who happens to be the same person as the one who's saying lichen. So she makes that association. And moss, in turn, came from this conventional association of moss growth on old trunks and stone rocks in the wood. And we use it about people too. So, there's a long story about this, but you cannot say that any one of these people came up with the words by themselves. They took up associations from the others in the episode, and there is a very clear progression here, which is not predictable completely, but it's in a way logical, so that given what you have got so far, you could go on with a new association and move it in another direction. And the result of the whole trajectory here will be that they go from talking about old age and old verb forms, which we didn't see here, to social and biological androgynousness. So meaning making is in many situations a collective endeavor, as it is in these conversations. The meanings and the relevance relations are not inherent in the individual's utterances, or only partly there, but in the relations between utterances, between the new utterance and the prior utterances, and if you will, the next possible utterances may come later on. And this is commonplace in linguistic interaction. Sometimes participants come together in this way. Sometimes, of course, we tend to resist following others' thoughts and so on. Languaging is partly a social shared business. Now I want to present a set of examples in which single utterances change directions in the course of their production. And these utterances are also, have also Swedish originals, but I've taken the liberty of translating those into English here. I will use a kind of utterance that are called pivot utterances to exemplify the fact that speakers often don't produce sentences expressing thoughts, so-called complete thoughts, following normative grammatical rules. But they are involved in online processes of what people call incrementation, that is, processes in which the progressive utterances are built piece by piece, adding fragments to parts already produced. And here, as before, what has been produced can be continued in different ways, and as a result, you might get a sentence which begins with one syntactic structure and changes into another one. So that is a definition, part of the definition of a pivot utterance. And the whole utterance is often deviant from written language-based perspective, which is why these very common, very frequent utterance types in Swedish and other languages. I don't know too much about Russian here, but I'm sure you have it, but different languages may have different conditions or opportunities for certain kinds. But they are very frequent in interactive spoken discourse. Also, to some extent, when you write blogs on the net and so on. And such an utterance can be analyzed as consisting of three parts. There is one part which is called the pre-pivot. We'll soon see examples of this. Then follows what's called the pivot, which is the turning point of the utterance. That's where the first structure ends, and then it turns out that this will start a new structure. And the pivot plus the rest of the utterance, which is called the post-pivot, would then look differently. There are some other points here. You can. We will look at a couple of examples here. In number 2A, the first one should be 2A here. Somebody says, this is a seminar leader who is asking his assistant in an academic seminar, are there any arrangements for lunch? We don't have we? So what's going on here is that he is starting with a question, a direct interrogative. Are there any arrangements? That is distinctly an interrogative construction. But coming to any arrangements for lunch, he realizes that there are probably no such arrangements. So he goes on to say, we don't have we? So here he claims that, or assumes, that there aren't any plans, but it's still asking for a response, which you can see in the tag question, have we? But it goes from a question to a declaration which is tilted in favor of a negative answer. These things happen quite often. assertions get questions, questions get into, develop into assertions or assumptions. That is actually a subcategory of these pivot utterances, which leads to the fact that they are syntactically incoherent according to standard written grammar. Otherwise, it's often that the pre-pivot and the post-pivot provide different perspectives, or the post-pivot will make the utterance more specific. In 2b, for example, here's a priest who is explaining that the church has very long traditions. As you know, it's so that the church has been for 2,000 years. Up to that, it's quite coherent or cohesive, both pragmatically and semantically and syntactically. But then he says the church is built on a common faith, and that is possible if you take for 2,000 years as a beginning of that second structure. So you have, for 2,000 years, the church is built on a common faith. It's a fine, so-called fine sentence. But as you know, it's so that the church has been for 2,000 years, was also fine up to that point, but is incomplete. And it seems that the speaker changes from one intention into another. He wants to put what he has to say in terms of a common faith. Whether he had that in mind from the beginning or not, we can't say, of course. Sometimes such pivot utterances are very in a way repetitive, in the sense that it seems that the pre-pivot repeats what the post-pivot also says. But if you look at the details, you'll find some differences. I included one example of that to see here, which is about the very well-known Swedish film director Ingmar Bergman, who in his old age had a female servant who served him with meals and everything during the day. And at one point she says how he wanted his dinners, and she says, and then he came down, you know, at 6 o'clock, micropause there, sharp, he came down. There at 6 o'clock sharp becomes a pivot with the first part. Then he came down, you know, at 6 o'clock sharp, and at 6 o'clock sharp he came down. He came down is repeated here, so in one sense it's superficial in the post-pivot, but it seems that this woman, after having said at 6 o'clock, she hesitates. Was it 6 o'clock, or should she say something more? And the point, of course, was that he was so punctual. He came down exactly at 6 o'clock, and then dinner should be served. So when she has said sharp, she has changed her claim in for her possibly important way, and that may elicit the post-pivot, because she has people seem to have forgotten about their previous what they said previously. Now, okay. So there are the explanations of the context. I didn't remember that. Anyway, there is one more example here which I skip, I think, because I want to move on to a totally different set of examples, which doesn't involve much language at all. And I show these things by courtesy of Sune Stephensen i Odense, who have developed what he and his colleagues call cognitive event analysis, which is often applied to experimental problem-solving tasks. And here we'll see a few features of such a task, which is the following. A subject is instructed to distribute 17 animals, and they are represented here by 17 small zebras, figurines, into 4 enclosures called pens. A pen is an enclosure. So the subject should construct 4 pens and then distribute 17 animals in such a way that each pen contains an odd number of animals. And they get the materials, they get pipe cleaners to make pens, they get these 17 animals, they get pen and paper to make notes and try out things. There is a time limit of 10 minutes. But what they don't get is a solution to the problem. And in fact, there is no solution to the problem of what he calls an arithmetic type. Because the natural thing is, of course, to try to distribute them. You put an odd number of animals into the pens, for example, 5 in the first one, 3 in the next one, and 3 in the third one, and then you are left with 6, an even number for the last one. And if you start with 5 and then follow it up with 3 in the next and 1 in the third, you will have 8 left. And so on. So, for example, if you start with 9 in the first pen, and then 1, and then 1, you will have 6 left. And simply there is no solution in which you can avoid having a pen with an even number of animals. This is the beginning of the table looks. This is shot from a video camera that was mounted in the ceiling, so you can see the table from above, and to the left you have the pipe cleaners. There is a bunch of 17 small figurines. You have an instruction printed on a piece of paper, and you can use a pen and a piece of paper to try out solutions. And you see the hands, actually, of the subject there. This was done with 50 different subjects, but they analyzed in great deal only the performance of one, called P27. And they analyzed the 10 minutes in coding it into actions and reactions at 1,1200 times during these 10 minutes. And here is the beginning of that patient's arrangement. She has made the pens here by putting together the cleaners, and we have 4 different pens, and then all the animals which she is going to distribute. And she tries that several times, and I won't show you this, because what happens later on is that she fails. Every time she fails, of course, because you can't distribute the 17 animals according to the rules. Then for some serendipity, she happens to put one of the pens partly overlapping with another one. So you have this situation to the left here. There are the animals in the middle of the table, and you have the empty pens there. But you have these 2 pens. She happens to do this, and then it seems she comes up with the idea that maybe one could have them partly overlapping. So this is what you see at B there, and I'll show you here also the final result, when she has for the first time succeeded to put the animals exhaustively into these 4 ones with an uneven number, an odd number of animals in each. And then, as we will see, she will try out that solution several times in order to check it up. And the final thing that she does is that when she is sure that this is a solution, she will organize the animals so they look nicely in the final pattern, which is the picture to the left there. So what happens here is there's a lot to read here, and I will not go through this. Maybe you cannot see it, but it turns out that in all these 50 subjects, they go through the whole sequence, but some of them don't succeed. What is the difference? The difference is that they don't come up with what Stephenson called a set theoretical solution. That you can have sets of entities that partially overlap. Sets can overlap, but they sort of trick them into believing in an arithmetic method, which didn't work. But what happens here in this case, and in some in a number of different cases too, is that you have a preparation phase. That's what they do in the beginning. They try to see what they have and maybe make notes and so on. Then they try out, as she did, came up with a solution which was a failure. They went into an impasse where they didn't know how to go on, and then there was a breakthrough in the cognitive process when, by serendipity, they came up with this idea of letting the pens overlap, and then after that, there is a short period where they sort of ponder that. Then they try it out with all the animals, came up with the fact that it works, so they have validated the solution, and then in the expiry they use the time to organize the things. And here is a timeline in which you can see how the length of these different phases in numerical indications, and they are milliseconds here, so that first there is from minus 365 to minus 352 is 113 milliseconds. That's about 2 minutes that they used for the preparation. Then there are 227 seconds, 227 milliseconds, sorry. No, I think seconds, actually. Trying out the arithmetic solution, and then there is the impasse, which lasts not very long, only a few milliseconds, and then there is what they call the primary event pivot, where the breakthrough actually happens. They come to this conclusion that it might be possible if you do it this way, and then they try that out for about 90 milliseconds, and then there is 132 milliseconds, I think, on the expiry method. So we can say that in this experiment, Stephenson and collaborators are especially interested in the cognitive trajectory as shown in the behaviors, and to some extent think aloud utterances, but there was very little of that as far as I know. Before and after the event pivots, what is it that happens? You have to get into an impasse. You have to ponder the situation, and then, if you are lucky, you find by serendipity, by coincidence, a solution which they say is dependent on a breakthrough, which is defined as a reconfiguration of the distributed cognitive system to achieve an acceptable solution to the problem at hand. So the sudden insight that you can use it, you can solve the task by using a set theoretical solution, is a precondition for solving the situation. And it's significant that almost all the subjects, according to the authors, used pen and paper trying to solve the task. But as long as they tried it only on an arithmetic model, no one succeeded. They had to find this other solution, and they found it by serendipity, by coincidence. So this example would be used here to illustrate that we use the affordances of things in our environment in order to solve problems in order to cognize, to make sense. So I see that my time is running out, and I was kind of predicting that, so I'll skip this part, which is about finding one's way in the world. And I will simply summarize by saying that I've preferred to talk about sense-making in the world to using the word cognition, because I think that sense-making is a broader term, and this is closer to what we do in the world and of the world. So sense-making, the ability to make sense, that is something that penetrates human existence, and it's much more than about brains. It's also about using the brain for understanding how the body is and how the world appears to us, the outer world. It's much more than consciousness, because many of these things are not consciously deliberated. They occur automatically, routinely, by serendipity sometimes. They are much more than material processing in neural circuits. They might involve symbolic processing, but that symbolic processing sometimes takes place in the brain, but it can also be used by using material artifacts like written language, mathematical formal language, musical notation will enable people to do things they couldn't do without those artifacts. It involves sense-making in the world, involves more than direct interaction between people, although direct interaction lurks behind a lot of sense-making, but we can do it by ourselves once we have learned how other people do it, once we have learned enough of language and other symbolic means. But it's more than spoken languaging. It's not just spoken languaging. It's also the use of language as inscribed on external artifacts. And I would say that we have in linguistics for long assumed simply that spoken language is just the same as written language, or the other way around, when there are lots of differences in their contexts, affordances, and what they can help us to do. Also, sense-making is more than the concrete situations, involves our relations to our experience of former situations that we use. And it's more than individual agency. It's not just individual, there is also partially shared agency at stake. And for example, it involves more than one single kind of truth. There is not only the scientific truth that we believe in, at least for some time, until someone finds a better theory. But there is also the embodied truth that we use and use successfully in ordinary life. So we do believe that the sun goes up in the east and moves over the sky and sets in the west. That's true at one level, but it's not true scientifically. But we need that embodied truth also, and so on. This was basically what I had to say. Thank you so much. Спасибо.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me? Thank you very much, Professor Linell, for a very rich lecture. Now there is some time for questions. Please, Artemi.
There is a linguistic theory of humor which suggests that in a dialogue we always look for ambiguity and use this ambiguity to suggest jokes regarding your first example. There is linguistic and psychological theory of politeness which, for example, explains negations. We don't have lunch, don't we? So it is suggested by the theory of politeness. And there is a psychological theory on insight problem solving, which suggests that we try to look for unusual usage of the objects or unusual arrangements of the objects. Maybe I didn't get the point. Do you follow these theories, or do you suggest some other explanation, theoretical explanations for these phenomena?
Well, thank you. You take up several important issues there, which I simply didn't address. I was closer to issues that have to do about the true nature of spoken interactional language, how utterances are built, for example. But obviously, in the first example, with the joking that went over to a serious discussion, there were several clues in that conversation. If you had heard the recording, which there was no point of playing here, but it's a kind of changing the key of the whole conversation. They move from a joking key to a serious key, and everybody sort of seems to follow that, even though it was initiated by one of the participants. So certainly all these things that distinguish between different genres, different activity types, serious and non-serious use of language, for example, as you take up, were not addressed in the lecture. And there were other things that you mentioned as well, that politeness, for example, surely is also something, and I wouldn't throw out politeness theory completely. Indeed, I would say that this has been done too easily by certain linguistically oriented researchers, because they think that politeness is too sort of superficial and it must have some more basic explanations. But I think there are explanations on different levels, and politeness is a cultural issue, largely.
Okay. We have time for a few more.
У меня, если можно, да? Thank you very much for your lecture. I think that your examples were very telling, especially about the birth of new cognitive units in dialogues, and as well as the analysis of the cognitive situation. However, I have a question related to the first part of your talk, which is about methodology. I think that all of us in cognitive science from different disciplines are aware of the legend and metaphor of blind people trying to explain what the elephant is. Now, my question, doesn't it seem obvious for you, just from a simple common sense, that extending the list of the descriptions from different aspects which you criticized first, with another one or call it social interactionist, dialogical mind, dialogism, has the deficiency that it negates itself just because it is another aspect of trying to explain the elephant from a restricted point of view. And that the elephant, the tail is not a rope, the leg is not a column, the body is not a wall. And we need something radically different. Not just to get into the fallacy of extending the graveyard of ism, which is doomed in the next 10 years to be criticized in the way you criticized all the previous restricted views. So we should look for something which encompasses it all, but is also radically different, taking it all into account. And our responsibility is to look for this new approach, but not another angle or point of view as you presented.
Well, I suppose there were several questions there and big issues buried in among the presuppositions of it. Probably I don't agree with you. I was, for example, listing those different characterizations of the mind, the shared, social, embodied, dialogical, and so on, because they are fairly mutually compatible. And it's just a matter of different groups of people preferring different terms for more or less the same thing. They are interested in the same phenomena, but they use different terms because they perhaps focus on different aspects, perhaps different parts of the elephant in some sense, you know. But if I were more serious, I would say that the important thing is not to end up in neuromania, as I would have said if I had time for the sixth section here, where I build quite a lot on popular book by Raymond Tallis called Aping Mankind, I think it is. Yeah, and his point is, well, he claims he's a neurologist or neuroscientist, and it's not that we are negative towards neuroscience, but he argues that neuroscience has been used to illuminate so many other fields in the humanities and social sciences in ways that are simply absurd, because the humanities and social sciences know much more about the mind beforehand. And
what we see now as neuromania is just another ism, and the way you described it actually very well as a segregated, yeah. It is just another segregated ism, and it goes to the same graveyard. It will be buried in the future. So I am not mentioning neuroscience as a seventh alternative solution. I am saying that we need something radically different. We need the global cognitive theory which will take all together, and it is not arithmetic matter.
Yeah, let me just say that I'm not a cognitive scientist. I'm a dissenting linguist rather, but I think that the kind of atmosphere or within the cognitive sciences is much more open for different perspectives than it is in those petrified sciences like formal linguistics and so on. And maybe neuroscience is much more helpful. But I think there are too many humanists who simply want to give away their knowledge because neuroscience in some quarters is evaluated as the only science. You know, humanities is something else. Yeah. No.
Okay. I have, of course, a smaller question. There also will start with a metaphor. Information exchange followers in linguistics would say that communication is about exchanging information. Then came the interactionists, and in a way they threw away the baby with the water from the vat. Then those who wanted to return the baby in the vat came and said that we jointly construct and reconstruct meanings in communication. Constructivist approach. As far as I understand, if my understanding is correct, is that what you were introducing by the under the term of this pivot structures or phrases or words. What is there besides just the repetition of the words and jointly and associated meanings, like from hair to beard and like that, that actually allows us to construct the meaning? Because this is the central actually question for all of us who work in this trend of constructivist interactionism to work with. That's the point that we have to solve.
Well,
thank you.
First of all, of course, metaphors have a tremendously extensive role to play, but there's more work to do in that area. But most importantly, I didn't go into the semantics of those concepts or terms or things in the domain of hair, moss and lichen and all that. That was just an example, and it was not the substance of that example that I wanted to communicate, but the fact that people build upon their build upon what the others have contributed, so that when someone at some point there says X, let's say social androgynousness, then it would be misleading to say that only that person came up with that idea, because it grew out of this interaction between people's utterances, and you could also say perhaps between people's ideas and metaphors and so on. So in that sense, the example could be quite another one, I suppose. Of course, people are not willing to play with words in the same way in all situations. That's what I meant by we are not always in a joking mode.
I'm afraid we have to conclude. I just want to say that I like that distinction between I and E theories, and maybe we should change the orthography and write interaction with E at the beginning.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much once more, Professor Linell.
Thank you. Спасибо вам.